Hi, I'm Melissa Grimshaw, one of the clinical research and education librarians here at the Harvey Cushing John Hay Whitney Medical Library at Yale. Today's session is dipping your toes into evidence synthesis, understanding review types, crafting research questions, and the basics of comprehensive searching. I always like to especially point out this is dipping your toes, so this is going to be a very high level overview. The goals of today are to describe the methodology of an evidence synthesis review, develop an answerable research question, create a concept table, and identify the appropriate databases that you may want to search for your project. I always like to highlight our library resources and services for evidence synthesis. Our current model is that we have self-service where you are using all of our resources here at Yale and our ready-made material. We also have consultant service or co-author where we discuss the question formulation, guidance with the development process, protocol development, search strategies, and using bibliographic organizational tools. In co-authorship model, we also work on manuscript development and you have support from the library staff. Please check out our links below to the library's website where you can apply your project for our library services, and you'll find all of our other tools and resources for evidence synthesis. I just want to highlight we do have access to EndNote and Covidence here at Yale, and those are really great resources for evidence synthesis. So if you're considering one of those resources, you may also want to sign up for a class that's covering those resources. So let's jump right into review types. So I always like to point out this Grant and Booth article from 2009. There is a replacement article that's a little bit older. I think it came out in 2019. Link and citation information to that a little further into my presentation. But the new one is very complicated and has a lot of different review types. Grant and Booth from 2009 only brought up 14 review types. So it really simplifies the different review types that you may want to use. So it's a great starting point. And so I would definitely read this article first before you read their newer article that's more comprehensive. And it's also really great, has this table where it breaks it down by the review type, the description, how exhaustive or not exhaustive the search is, whether or not there should be a formal appraisal associated with this review type, the type of synthesis that you'll see in this review, and then how exactly the analysis is run. So it kind of breaks this down. Now, I will say 2009 was a very long time ago. So if you do base your decision on that, you'll also want to look to see if there's any reporting guidelines that have been established and changed, the structure of that review type since the last time the Graham Booth article was published. When you're breaking this down, there's some basic questions you may want to think about when you're deciding what type of review you're doing. First, related to topic, will your review question answer a specific question or question? If your answer to this is yes, then you may be doing a systematic review or meta-analysis. If you're answering a much broader question, it might be a scoping review. Perhaps you're doing a rapid review, a narrative review, or the state of an art review. Now, when I say specific question, like that's hard to visualize, right? So what I generally say is a scoping review question is more like in population X, what is the best treatment? Versus a systematic review, we'll see a question that says in population X, is treatment A or is treatment B better? And then looking to see within those papers the evaluation tools and the metrics in which they made that decision. The end of a systematic review is generally you're giving a recommendation or a guideline. And in a scoping review, a lot of times you'll see more of like a call to action. So we're saying, we need more evidence, or we need a higher level of evidence, or there's too much bias in this evidence that we have and we need more research. Of course, you can have a scoping review where you come to a conclusion, right? So that's not a strict line in the sand, but frequently that is one thing that perhaps may be the differentiating factor. Um, Next, you want to think about your team. Does your team consist of multiple members with dedicated time for the project? Evidence synthesis is very time consuming because everything has to be done in duplicate, right? To reduce the human bias within your and error within your project. So if you have multiple members, perhaps you are doing a systematic review or scoping review. If you do not have at least two members, and perhaps three, so that you have a third to resolve those conflicts, I would say you're definitely doing a rapid review, a narrative review, or a state-of-the-art review. You should not see a systematic review published with just one author. That, is not following the best practice methodology by, any of this associations. Um, Although I will say there is an allowance for AI being that second person. So, those methodologies have not been as accepted as of yet, but perhaps they will. So I don't want to date myself. And this presentation for those watching in the future. So there may be some capabilities of a smaller team in the future if those AI um, options become more accepted in the methodology of published literature. Okay, next we want to think about the types of information. So, is your topic established with similar research studies investigating the issue? If so, then you may be doing a systematic review or a meta-analysis. If no, perhaps you're doing a scoping review. So, um, I like to think about this as you can't compare apples to oranges and call it a systematic review, right? Or a meta-analysis. You can do a narrative systematic review, but frequently you need them to be directly comparing with the same type. So you can't compare a cohort study to a case control because the directionality is wrong and you can't the metrics are not the same, right? So whereas you're in a scoping review, it's a little more wide. You're not necessarily pulling all of that specific metric data from the metric outcome data from the paper itself. So it may be more of a scoping review narrative synthesis. So these are a few additional resources that you may decide to look at when deciding your review type. Like I said, that Grant and Booth article that I really recommend from 2009 is on here, and Sutton is that updated version that came out in 2019. I also always love to highlight the what review is right for you interactive tool. So this interactive tool asks you a bunch of questions, and based on those questions, it makes a recommendation of a review methodology or a few review methodologies, depending on how open-ended your responses are. So that can be really helpful to help you narrow down what type of reviews you possibly might want to do. Okay, so let's talk about next are protocols. So a protocol describes the rationale, hypothesis, and planned review methods of the review. And it should be prepared before a review is started and then used as a guide to carry out your review. They should be registered a priori. And I always like to highlight for everybody that if you are registering a systematic review protocol with Prospero, it must be done before data extraction. If you say that you have started data extraction, Prospero will automatically reject your registry entry. So we want to make sure that that is done before you start data extraction. Now, for evidence synthesis, data extraction is not when you start pulling the studies from the databases. Data extraction is a step within the process of evidence synthesis, and it happens when you have your included studies and you're gathering data within those in those studies. So just remember Prospero before data extraction. There are several different places that you could publish your protocol. And so Prospero is generally the gold standard for systematic reviews. It is totally free. It does take 10 days for them to post it on their website. So just make sure you keep that in mind. Um, Obviously, the process is a lot longer than 10 days, but you definitely need to get it in before 10 days. So that way you can get that, the unique identifier for your protocol. Um, there is also Open Science Framework. You could publish a protocol paper. There are other paid subscription protocol websites that you could publish it on. I generally recommend Open Science Framework. It's fast and free. Prospero does not publish scoping review protocols. So if you're doing a scoping review, you would have to do Open Science Framework or one of the other repositories. Um, I also highlight here that there is a Prisma for protocols. So everything that you need to include in your protocol. And so if you're not familiar with the protocols, please take a look at Prisma P so that you know what information you need to include. And then also, I will just note on this for protocols, they can be living documents. So it's important to note that this is a study design where you're using found data, right? You're not generating it yourself. If it was a randomized control trial, you'd have a lot more control over the information that you're capturing. So if, you get to data extraction and you determine that, there's a really cool thing within the research that you're doing that you just never thought of, a different scope, a different metric, something new and exciting. You don't have to not report on that just because you didn't include it in your protocol. You have the ability to go in and make an amendment and submit the amendment and just explain why you made it that adjustment. So, for instance, I had a study where they were looking at transgender health, reproductive health for transgender persons. And so we did the search, and then they quickly realized that cancer was something that, was not included in our search for reproductive health, but they found a lot of studies that focused on cancer. So in our second update, we did have an addition of these new cancer terms into our search strategy. So that way they would be able to locate more of those papers and report on it. And then we made an amendment in the protocol that said, we uncovered this information and we wanted to extract data. So we expanded the search. So it is a living document that you can make edits to. Okay, so to talk more about reporting guidelines, a reporting guideline ensures high standards for the documentation of the methods and the results, reduces reporting bias, and ensures transparency. So there are a lot of different reporting guidelines that you can use for evidence synthesis. The most popular is PRISMA, which is preferred reporting items for systematic review. And there are also several extensions. So there's a scoping review extension. There are specific systematic review extensions. So, for instance, if you're doing a network meta-analysis, they have a specific extension for that type of review. I always like to highlight SWIM because it's really underutilized. So, SWIM is synthesis without meta-analysis. And it really highlights all of the parts of Prisma that you should be covering, even if you are not doing a meta-analysis. So essentially, it is an add-on product. You would still use Prisma, but the answers that you can't, the boxes or check list items that you are unable to fulfill in Prisma because you're not doing that meta analysis, you would look at SWIM to determine if you're including enough information on those items. I feel like it really improves the quality of a systematic review. And I often say if you're unable to fill out SWIM and you're doing a systematic review, then really you have written a scoping review. So there are some very distinct requirements like reporting heterogeneity, which you will not get in a scoping review that you should be reporting on if you've done a systematic review. Additionally, we have Moose. which is meta-analysis for observational studies. I will say that some journals have come away from Moose and essentially said that you could fill out Prisma instead. Other journals still use Moose, even though is fairly old. It's from the early 2000s. And then we have our last one, which is on qualitative research. So the narrative of synthesis with qualitative research looks a little different than if you were doing a quantitative analysis. Okay, so let's take a step in a different direction and think about developing the research question. So when you're formulating your research question, you may want to think of PICO. So your patient or population, your intervention or exposure, your comparison or control, and your outcome. So in the question of do patients with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and obstructive sleep apnea have a higher mortality rate? We would break this down to our populations, our patients with COPD, our exposure is obstructive sleep apnea, our comparator is patients without sleep apnea, and our outcome of interest is mortality. Okay, so moving on to search tips. It's really important that when you're developing a search strategy, even if you're doing a clinical, like a quick search versus an exhaustive search, that you're using truncation. So you want to break down that word to the closest root of that word where everything else would be relevant. So for instance, if we were doing something with children, we would want to put children with an asterisk after it so that we're getting child, children, childhood, any relevant terms. So this is something that you want to do, but you also want to be really careful about, right? So we want to save time by not spelling out every single iteration of a word, but we also want to ensure that we're not pulling in too many or unrelevant results because we've gone to a route that has several iterations that are not relevant to us. You may want to put quotations to find phrases. So, for instance, post-traumatic stress. Now, this is really important because if we do not put quotations around that information, around that phrase, then perhaps they're talking about a post-traumatic knee injury and they're having stress because they, lost their job because they weren't mobile for 6 months. So if we use the quotations, we can force a relationship between those terms. It's important to remember that databases are not that smart. So they're looking for exact character matches. So they're if you don't put quotations around those terms, some of the databases will interpret that as an and in between every term, and they'll just look anywhere in the index field for those terms. We also want to use Boolean operators. So for or, we want to combine similar concepts to broaden the search. So for instance, child or adolescence or teen or youth. And so that will bring in all of these different types. And so we want to think about how the people are describing the title and abstract of the papers that we want to retrieve. Are they calling them adolescents, teens, young adults? What's the population of interest and how can we retrieve all of those in? And so this is even really important when you're thinking about your research question, because if you say you're interested in people that, could potentially be on their parents' health insurance, right? So we're looking 0 to 26. We would have to include adults in that because adult starts at 18. So do you really need those people between 18 and 26 or is 0 to 18 sufficient to bring in that information? So next we want to think about the Boolean operator and. And we use this to combine concepts and to narrow our search. So for instance, in this example, we may want to do child and post-traumatic stress disorder. So this will get us the overlap of papers that discuss both children and post-traumatic stress disorder. I call this librarian math, but we need to use parentheses when we're searching different groups or concepts together. So, for instance, if we put parentheses around child or adolescent, then we know that we want that together. So we want either children or adolescents. And then using the Boolean operator and we'll combine that with our PTSD terms. Now, if we had no parentheses here, then it could interpret it as we want anything that has the word child in it and anything that has the word adolescent and PTS or post-traumatic stress. So it's really important that we use parentheses so that we're getting the information that we're looking for and not pulling in other things. So it's really important when you're looking and entering in your search that you add parentheses, and then you also double check that the parentheses mapped the way that you were looking for them to. It's also really important to spell out any acronyms, to use singular and plural forms of each word, and use British spelling. And I say this especially for the hematology folks. All of their terms have extra pseudonyms because of the British spelling. And so it's really important that you think about those, especially if you're including populations outside of the United States, because that's how they would be spelled in the databases, and the databases are looking for an exact character match. So if you leave out that extra A next to the E, you're not going to pull in all of those papers, even though the study may be extremely relevant to your research question. Okay, so when we think about our search, we also want to break this down into concept tables. So a concept table can be broken down by your PICO information. And then you want to think about in each database, what are the controlled vocabulary that you need to use? And then also your keywords and text words. This also helps you organize your Boolean operators so that way you know exactly where your ors and ands can be. So each of these sections would be in a parentheses with an and in between them. So if we go back to our original question about COPD and sleep apnea, we would want to think about all of the different ways that this is described. And so I pulled a few pseudonyms here. You can see there's British spellings, English spellings, acronyms, different ways that you can describe each term. And then, we have mortality and death also as our outcomes. So I will say about this, frequently I do not recommend searching by outcome for systematic reviews or scoping reviews or any evidence synthesis project. But that is an exception if you're doing a hard outcome that you would almost always report in the title and abstract of the paper. So a lot of times your outcome they're not fully reported within the paper. So you'll go to your table 2 and there might be secondary and maybe a third outcome that wasn't originally reported. And so depending on what your research question is, that could be potentially relevant information. So you don't want to eliminate anything that you perhaps need to look at in full text. But progressions free survival for oncology questions and death or mortality are pretty frequently described within the title and abstract. So I generally recommend this as a hard outcome too, something that is like, death or, still alive, right? It's one or two options. Whereas if you're doing a quality improvement outcome, that's really difficult to describe because we have lots of options on how to describe quality improvement. Are we saying physical function? Are we saying quality of life? Are we saying, mental health? Physical wellness? What is our metric for quality improvement? Kind of idea. So you want something that's very easy to describe so that way you know that you've captured everything. If you're doing something with QI, you should probably not be including that as as an outcome, right? So if your QI is your intervention, right, that it perhaps looks a little different. But definitely meet with a librarian and talk it over with them. I'm sure that we are all willing to give you our opinions on the concepts that you should include for your search strategy. Okay, so how do you approach an evidence synthesis search? So first, you pick a drafting database. So my drafting database is always Ovid Embase. And why is this? First, I think that Ovid platform has a lot of extra functionality that allows you to be more specific when you're searching than, say, PubMed or some of the other databases, which just do not have the same capabilities or the capabilities aren't done as well. I also always like to start big, right? I don't want to do my search and then translate it from Medline. And so Medline and PubMed are the same database, different interface. But it's actually the smallest of all the medical databases because it is the catalog of the National Library of Medicine. So, it's highly curated, very reliable, lots of great information in there, but it is not all of the information. And sometimes you take the question from that database, and once you translate it into Ovid Embase, your result set grows by 100, 200%. So you've got, uh, you know, 2,000 articles within Medline, you go into Embase, and now you have 6,000. And so, well, 2,000 was, convenient, and the scope of the project worked with the capacity of the team. With that 6,000 articles, that's just one database, and maybe that is not going to work for your team. So I always like to start big so that we don't have any surprises once we go to the other databases. So first you picked your drafting database. And then you want to think about your essential concepts, your PICO. And then you want to think about search versus screening criteria. So that's that similar idea of what I mentioned before about the outcomes, right? Whether or not it's going to be in that title and abstract. So when you're searching a database, you're searching index fields. You're not searching the full text for the majority of the databases. PubMed Central, Google Scholar are the exceptions to this rule. But the rest of the databases, they're not looking at full text. They're looking at title, abstract, author keywords, controlled vocabulary. There's a bit more, a couple fields that you're searching, but you're not searching the full text. So we can't think about it as what do I want to include if I was looking at the full paper. We're trying to think about what needs to be in the title and abstract for you to have to look at it to determine whether or not it meets your inclusion exclusion criteria. Another one of these is location. So location is very unreliable to search by. So I use my United States hedge very limitedly on projects because I don't think that it captures everything, and it also captures too much of things, right? So when I use my United States hedge, it could be pulled in because one of the authors on the paper is from the United States, not necessarily that the work itself was done in the United States or the population of the subject was in the United States. So that might be something that really needs to be a screening criteria rather than a search criteria. So you're going to have to go through those results and try to determine why it was retrieved by the database. Next, you want to compile your search terms for each concept. And so you're going to do this by combining text words, which is natural language. So, we got to have our heart attack and our myocardial infarction and our STEMIs and our non-STEMIs and our whole list of words for that. But we also want to include controlled vocabulary for every database that has controlled vocabulary. So, mesh is going to be what you see in PubMed and Medline. And then Mtree is what's being used for Embase. And so you can search these within the database itself to determine what the controlled vocabulary is for the concept that you're searching. And so you can put this in your concept table and build it out. And then you want to combine all of the terms for the search strategies. So you're going to use search operators, and we talked about and or. So I will also say we want to use not really, really sparingly. I frequently say not is not acceptable in systematic reviews. There is some uses, right? So if we're nodding out controlled vocabulary, that's what Cochrane does for their to remove animal studies. They go not animals. The next line is, sorry. They do animals as a controlled vocabulary. The next line is animals and humans, and then they use the not command in the next line where they say one, not two, and then they take that line, the three lines we just built, and they will not out that result set from what your search is. So the reason why we do this is that that controlled vocabulary should be animals and not humans, right? And we've highlighted any paper that says they're about animals and humans, and we're keeping those and just eliminating those. Now, why you wouldn't use not as a keyword search is that a lot of papers will frequently say this is well studied in animals and not humans. Here we're presenting a human study, right? So that may meet your inclusion criteria. We're looking for humans. And because the word animal is in there, even though it's saying this is not a study, just that the research we have is in mice, etc. Because you have that animal term, the databases don't understand context. It's just going to eliminate that paper for you. So, and because natural language sometimes does allow us to include that information in our abstracts, it's not a reliable way to eliminate that information, and you may be eliminating papers that you should be including. So we don't use not very frequently in systematic review search methodology. Next is adjacency. And so adjacency or proximity searching is sometimes what it's referred to, is my favorite command for all searching. Adjacency allows you to force the words to be within a few words of each other, which allows you to expand the information without having to expand the amount of results that will come in without having to add a whole bunch of terms, right? So, for instance, if we put ovarian adjacency 3 cancer, we would, or ovary adjacency 3 cancer, we'll get papers that say ovarian cancer or ovary cancer. And we'll also get papers that say cancer of the ovary, right? So we want to make sure that we're getting any ways that could be used to determine uh, any words that can be used to describe the concept in the literature. Then you want to think about search filters and fields. So search filters, we actually don't recommend that you use the database filters when you're doing these types of searches. So, use those very sparingly. Instead, I would recommend that you look up different validated hedges for systematic reviews. And so a hedge is just that concept. So, like a randomized control trial, Cochrane has a validated search hedge for randomized control trial. So you can take their information and cite it. Really important to cite. But you take that information from their paper, reuse that part of their search to just get those papers that you're looking for. Additionally, you want to think about what search fields are relevant for your research question. Generally, I'm searching a lot of for title, abstract, author, keyword, also controlled vocabulary fields. You may want to search all fields. You may want to add certain things. So, for instance, if I was searching in Ovid Embase and I had a drug name or a compound name or anything like that, I would add the field DY to my search string. And so that's bringing in any drug indexed information. With the drugs, you may also want to search the CAS registry field, and that will bring in, anything that uses that compound or the registry number for the compound. So that can also be really helpful in bringing in like clinical trials for early development on drugs. Okay, so how to compile the search results. First, you want to generate related terms. So you may do this by meaning, by adding same or or similar meaning terms, closely related concepts. It's really important when you're searching for something fuzzy, and we use the word fuzzy to describe something that's not as established in the literature or could be described multiple ways. But it's really important for you to think about these fuzzy concepts and how anyone can describe them so that you're pulling them in. It's also really important to search for different word forms, like I talked about, in plurals and singular versions, acronyms, abbreviations, different spellings. It also is important to do professional or jargon, but also slang and vernacular terms too, that may have been used. Another thing you want to think about is historical terms. So, was this described the same way in the 1800s? And if not, should you include it? Is that paper from the 1800s still relevant today? Some questions it is, some questions it's not. Also, to highlight here, normally searching by date is not acceptable unless you have something that you can point to specifically when you're developing your research question. So, for instance, if you're looking at a population in a surgery, if there was a previous surgery that was used in this population, so say we were going from an open surgery to a closed surgery, and all of those previous open surgeries are no longer relevant because we've determined that, higher chance of infection and yada, 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 everything else, then we don't really want to look at all of that open surgery terminology. So we really want to think hard about that date and whether or not it's relevant. It's also really important that that date you have to defend, right? So a peer reviewer might ask you to explain why you added a date because the general recommendation is that this is an exhaustive search and so that you shouldn't be limiting. So it has to be something that you're directly pointing at. You can't really just say for evidence synthesis, and by that I mean scoping, systematic, umbrella, rapid, etc., that you're pointing to something within, the last 10 years. If you want to do that type of search where you're just updating, you might be doing a state of the art or state of the science review where you're limiting to 5, 10 years, or if there's, a review 3 years ago, you're just updating it from then. And that is a very acceptable type of review. It is just not a systematic review. So it's important to think about that. And then you also may want to include frequent spelling errors. It's really, really important to think about the different spelling errors. And you also may want to think about umbrella terms. So, for instance, if we're looking at something that is a QI initiative where you have changed, I don't know. You change something, right? So maybe you're doing something where you have an AI intervention or something that's going to reduce, that works with your electronic health record to identify at-risk patients, right? You may determine that you need to include umbrella reviews. So maybe in addition to your very specific terms for the specific intervention, you also do machine learning or artificial intelligence and QI to see what else comes out. But you want to think about how broad you really need to go. So with this, we're really thinking about sensitivity and specificity and how exactly those work together to ensure that you're not going too broad, but you're also not going too narrow either. So now we've generated all of our terms ourselves. Our next step is to gather terms, right? So we want to look at other publications to see how your information was described in those publications. I do recommend the Yale Mesh Analyzer for this. You just need some PubMed IDs. You throw them into the Yale Mesh Analyzer, and it will send you out some information about the controlled vocabulary, the title information, etc. There are other tools that you can use that look at the specific keywords that's used in the title and abstract too. So another option. Another really important field to look at is those author associated keyword terms. So how are the authors describing it? Another thing I really love to do is when I'm doing my searches, I will go and look at other search strategies and other systematic reviews to determine, did I miss anything? Do I need to think about something differently? How exactly has this been searched previously? And so if there's I will add the caveat that not all search strategies in published systematic reviews were built equally. So also have a critical eye when you're looking at those other reviews and ensure, you don't want to just start with this step, because we want to make sure that it's, the most comprehensive, in terms of sensitivity and specificity that our research question needs. So if we start with another person's search strategy, we may not think about all of the terms that we need, or we might skip things. I always find it as a great double check rather than my starting point. Another thing you may want to look is on databases. So, if you go into the PubMed mesh term search, you can go in there and enter that information, and then it will have all the entry terms. So how are all the different ways that the controlled vocabulary is used to describe this term, and that can also be a great starting point. Definitely not an ending point, but a great starting point. And then another thing I will frequently do is I go and I look at textbooks, encyclopedias, dictionaries to see how this is being described, or what exactly this term is used for. So if I'm doing anything, in my penias, I may want to do lack or low, adjacency three, whatever the penia that we're looking at is. So is it like white blood cells or muscle density, anything like that? So anything that I'm looking at with those, I would do all of the terms that are used, and then I may also do that lack, no, low, any other metrics like that, adjacency three, whatever the term is. Lastly, you may want to contact experts in the field, or ask your PI, did we cover everything? Are we missing anything? Do we need to add anything? Would you recommend removing anything? And that can also be helpful to determine the sensitivity and specificity of your question. Okay, so we now have an idea of what review type we want to do. We've talked about how we might think about breaking down our research question, to create, our how we're going to search. But let's think about the databases that we want to search. Um, so there are a lot of different parts of the search methods, and they're not all related to databases, which is really important to note. So in the general search for the standard, everyday systematic review search where you're getting traditional publications, we want to think about what databases we need. So, in general, I will search the databases Ovid Embase, Ovid Medline, or PubMed, sometimes depending on what my research question is and um, how comprehensive my search strategy is or complex. Um, and then Web of Science, Scopus. I always find it's really important to search Google Scholar because, like I mentioned earlier, that's the only one that's searching the full text. I do search that through Publish or Perish, to ensure that my web browser and previous search history is not impacting the results that I'm getting. There is a general rule, that librarians, or a recommendation, I shouldn't say rule. There's a general recommendation that librarians use depending on the number of results that you get in PubMed or Medline. You would either pull 200 or 100 results from Google Scholar. You can also do this by saturation, but that you can't automate as much. You would have to be in a web browser. So I recommend that you do an incognito web browser, to ensure that your cookies aren't impacting the result. Um, but then you want to think about specialized literature search databases. So, for instance, if you're doing anything mental health related, it's really, really important that you're also searching psych info. There's not a lot of overlap between the psych literature and the medicine literature in PubMed or any of the other databases. So it's especially important for that. Are you searching something where, for QI that the nursing literature would also be touching on? Because then it might be really important for you to search CINAHL. I do a lot with populations in prison, a lot of questions with populations in prisons. And then for those, it's also really important, like to add in the criminal justice databases, also maybe sometimes the sociology abstract databases. So depending on the search question you have, you may need to expand the number of databases that you're using. Um, for like minimal viable searching, I would definitely check with the journal that you're publishing with and see what other databases, previous papers that were searched, that were published have had searched, because that can give you a good idea of the standard within your field. But I do recommend at minimum Embase, PubMed or Medline, Scopus or Web of Science, and Google Scholar. Cochrane recommends that their database is searched for every single systematic review. So that's another one that you may want to throw in there. Okay, so covered the traditional databases. What about unpublished research, right? So for a systematic review or scoping review, you're being super, super exhaustive. So you may want to search for unpublished studies. Technically, you're supposed to reach out to, technically within the methodology, you should reach out to studies with relevant study design and ask them to use their data in your analysis. I will say pretty frequently that is not done, because it's so difficult, right, to get people to share their data or even to be aware that the data is has been generated somewhere. So you want to think about for your protocol whether or not you're including ongoing and unpublished studies. And what does that look like? How much information needs to be in those for you to be able to include it? And how are you going to handle that missing data and contacting the authors? So, you know, I would recommend that you have a plan. We're contacting them this amount of time, and what are you going to do if they don't respond? Because you don't want to get into a situation where your search is really outdated because you're waiting and waiting on information. Okay, then you want to think about non-traditional publication types. So gray literature, uh, you know, are government reports or policy documents going to be relevant to your question? Um, so it's really important to really think about what information you're going to be extracting from these papers to determine what study designs and types of resources have relevant information. If you're doing a scoping review, you know, these may be you may be interested in more of this information. Um, and so for the gray literature searching, some of this does come in from the databases, for instance. So, you know, we can find government reports and white papers in Google Scholar. So if you're using Google Scholar, you might bring those in. Conference abstracts are in Ovid Embase for some of the larger national conferences. But do you need to do some hand searching here too? So do we need to look at specific websites and look through those? You know, can you do a Google search on the domain for your concept? Which is very similar to number five too. But the general internet search will also bring in that gray literature. What about dissertations and abstracts? So there's a lot in gray literature, and you just have to figure out what you're including in your project, and then depending on what you're including, where you're going to search. Typically, because a lot of these ways of searching, you aren't able to pull in an RAS file that we can quickly throw up into Covenants for you. The gray literature searching, your librarian may give you suggestions or recommendations, but they do not do those searches for you. You'll want to do them, and it's really important. We'll get into the search log later, but to keep the date and all the information of what you searched. Okay, so then you want to think about manual searching. So like I mentioned, similar to the general internet searching, some of that can be hand searching. So going through the web pages and looking to see what policies they have listed. Or you may say, you know, this concept is super fuzzy. We're worried we're going to miss something. So in, you know, these top 10 journals of this, we're going to go and look through the papers and ensure that none of the title and abstracts in these relevant journals comes in. I would say hand searching is done a lot less frequently now that there's more robust ways to search, and that the journals are more frequently indexed on multiple databases. But it is still important if you're doing those fuzzy searches. And then you want to think about how you're going to automate the search going forward. So, on this chart, they talk about search alerts. I will say I don't agree with using search alerts, right? So, it's these projects often frequently go on for a long time. I would say I actually ran the numbers the other day, and the mean of the my projects from time into confidence until publication was 2.5 years about. um so are you going to remember every single time that you got an email to go upload those citations into Covidence? I find it so much easier to just run the database updates either every 6 months or right before or once and then right before publication to get all of the new publications and then go back and screen what was retrieved that was new. I think this helps with understanding the numbers, ensuring something doesn't get lost. It reduces burnout for the team or alerts. And then, you just rescreen and then you just have to process the ones that are new, right? So if you're doing a meta-analysis, I definitely recommend that you do the search updates prior to running the analysis so that you don't have to rewrite or remake all the figures afterwards. But yeah, or you can do search alerts. I don't recommend it. And then you also want to think about known item searching. So, I really, really recommend having a list or providing your librarian with a list of validating articles. So these would be 5 articles that you already know about that are super relevant. And so what we do is we develop the search and then we search by title for your validating articles and we make sure that the search retrieved those papers, right? So if I'm looking at those and I'm like, these are not coming in, obviously my search is flawed and I need to go back through it and ensure that I'm not missing a concept or a term and I can kind of break it apart to figure out where this paper is getting lost and then add in additional terms. But it's really important that when you're selecting these papers that they're actually relevant because a lot of times I get, people send me something and they're like, we're only including randomized control trials and they send me a cohort study and I'm like, well, it's not going to be pulled in by my randomized control trial hedge, right? So you want these to be like the perfect papers, what is going to be included. And so that's a really great way to validate your search. Another way of doing this known work tracking is to do citation chasing. So you can do forward citation chasing or backwards. And backward citation chasing is when you take your included studies and you search all of the reference lists for other related studies, right? So the papers that are interesting and relevant to you should be quoting other relevant papers, right? And then you can do forward citation chasing. And so that's looking at any paper that cited your included study. I highly recommend citation chasing. I think it reduces the Western bias within these papers, and it also helps us find things, that we wouldn't find. It kind of ensures that especially important with the fuzzy concepts because it ensures that even if the search isn't perfect, we're capturing all of the relevant material. I use Citation Chaser to do this, just if anyone, is interested in how to do this. And then I deduplicate against all of the results of my screening that was already done. So I'm not looking at any new results. I'm only looking at the papers that were retrieved in citation chasing that didn't come back in the search. And then super important to check for notices. So is any of your included studies, were they retracted? Was there any adjustments? Did they come out and say that there was a error in their data and there's an adjustment? Because it's really important that if you have those included papers, you're aware of the potential biases or being able to fix that information for your analysis. All right, so let's back up and talk about our search goals. The goal of an evidence synthesis project is to collect as much relevant evidence as possible. So we're balancing sensitivity and specificity. We obviously don't want to go too broad and bring in too much information, but we want to make sure that we're capturing everything. I often call this like the dredging of the bottom of a pond, right? I want to ensure that I have pulled up anything relevant and that there's nothing missing in the bottom of my pond. Um, and we're doing this to minimize publication and reporting bias. And so, another thing to think about when you're trying to reduce bias in evidence synthesis is avoiding limiting the search by language, publication date, publication type, using those database filters that are not always as reliable, and using instead validated search concepts. We already talked about selecting databases, so I won't go over these again, but these are some of the main databases that you may want to pull in. Like I said, general recommendation would be 3 plus. And then also making sure you're searching different databases, right? So Medline PubMed is almost in every database because it's a free data set that they can add available through the National Library of Medicine. So Medline is an Embase. So if you're only searching Medline in Embase, you're really only searching the same database. So throw Google Scholar in there or Scopus, or another database to help kind of reduce the information. Now, you still always want to search Medline on Medline or PubMed. And so why is because the controlled vocabulary is different, the search functionality is different. You just want to, it's really important to also search that. Gray literature searching, we also talked about already, but searching central clinicaltrials.gov. I did hear something very exciting. Ovid Embase over the next couple of months is going to add all of clinicaltrials.gov into their database. So that's information that will be retrieved there, and you might not have to separately search clinicaltrials.gov. Theses and dissertations, conference abstracts, technical specifications and reports. Also think about preprints, market research, etc. Anything relevant that would be found in the gray literature. Okay, so it's so important if you're doing a review type that classifies as evidence synthesis. So our systematic reviews or scoping reviews, umbrella reviews, rapid reviews, anything where you're creating that method section that you're also preserving your search data. And I would even recommend it for your narrative reviews, right? So what happens if you get really busy doing something else and you come back to your research in a year and you need to update it? You want to go back and replicate what you did before to ensure that you're capturing the same kind of stuff. So with this, I recommend that you import all of your citations into a citation management software of your choosing. I prefer EndNote. And if you're using EndNote, remember to save the original, the deduplicated version if you have two versions of that EndNote file. And I would compress them. And so compressing the EndNote file is making an archival copy of it. And what I do is for EndNote, I create a database group for every database, and I put the citations into an appropriate database group depending on what database they came into. This helps me determine later if we get the question of why didn't this search come in, this citation come in from the search. I'll go and figure out what databases that journal is indexed in and should have come in, and then I go to my search and try to figure it out. So it's really important that you know what came from where. And some journals do ask you to report this actual journal number. I think like Academic Medicine is an example where they want to know how many citations came in from each database. So it's really important that you have that data just in case you need to provide it in your manuscript. I also keep a search log in addition to, the downloads of that information. And the things that would be in my search log is the database and platform, the exact date that you search the database. So I do a lot of research on what information is available about the quality of systematic reviews that are published. And quite frequently, the number one thing that I see not transparently done in systematic reviews is that the date will not have the exact date. It will say October. This was done in October of 2022 maybe, and I'm looking at it, I'm like, okay, well, the paper that, did they miss this paper? It was published October 1st, so technically it should have come in from their search because they searched in October, but maybe they did their search October 1 at midnight, and the paper wasn't added to the database until 8 a.m. And it would have come in had they searched on October 2nd. So it's really important to know, because you may get the question from your peer reviewer of why this article didn't come in. It also really tells people when this was done and how it was done. And I know October 2022 is specific, but it's just not as specific as enough. You need the actual day included in this date. Um, you want to have the search strategy in full detail for each database. In databases that allow you to link to the search, that's super helpful. So that way you can rerun it if you're doing those search updates I talked about. Some of the reporting guidelines also want to know who did the database search. So you may want to put initials next to it of who did it, especially if you divide and conquer with databases, and then the number of results. How you capture this information, you may want to do screenshots. You may decide to do Excel or a Word document, which is what I do. You can also capture this information in Covidence, so that, if you're doing a narrative review, you might not necessarily need the Word document or Excel document because you have that information in Covidence. Okay, search updates. And you can see I'm always really excited about search updates. Journals and editors typically want the search to be less than 3 to 6 months old at time of publication, which I realize is impossible, right? I just told you that it takes my teams frequently 2.5 years. And I'm not saying that it has to take that long. Sometimes people do it faster. Sometimes they do it slower. But journals want it to be up to date. They don't want to have a synthesis that's already outdated at time of publication. So frequently you need to do a search update. And so the way that I do this is I copy and paste directly from the search logs, or I use my links. And so we do this because retyping may lead to human error, just copying and pasting or doing something else. So by clicking the link, you're able to just redo it, and it reduces the chances that you have messed something up. Also, I'm just going to add it in here. I probably should have it on its own slide. Here at Yale, we encourage peer reviewing of a search strategy. So all of our searches are peer reviewed by another librarian, and that reduces human error in the original search. So if you are doing one, you definitely want to have another person look at it and ensure you have no typos, that your librarian math makes sense, your parentheses are all going in the right direction and have, the right number of them, and it's searching the databases in the way that you're looking for it to do. And so once you have that perfected, because you had someone peer review it and have a second set of eyes, the copy and pasting will lead to a reduction in, that chance of it happening again. Another important part of those search updates is, like I mentioned, looking for retracted articles. So is anything, of your included studies been retracted since the last time you checked the databases? Okay, so we're going to do a case example right now, using one of my previous systematic reviews. So the research question is, what is the incidence and relative risk of severe gastrointestinal adverse events in patients treated with Kxalate compared to controls? And then the second question was related to colon necrosis in the same population. So if we broke this down into a concept table, we have our drug key name and all of the pseudonyms. And like I was talking about before, the drug registry numbers, and our controlled vocabulary at the bottom. Next, we have our adverse gastrointestinal tract adverse reactions. And this is supposed to be super exhaustive, right? So there may be more that you're interested in, or you might say, I'm only interested in colon related ones, so I'm not really interested in nausea or vomiting. I'm going to exclude those. And so you really need to define your the scope of your concept when you're building out these terms. Um, and so this is a little more complex of a search, right? Because we're searching concept one and concept two or concept 3A or 3B. So we have our bowel, our colon, our gut, all of those terms, and then also our necrosis terms. So our finalized Ovid search, right, looks a little bit like this, where we have our controlled vocabulary, our keywords that we're searching. So the first concept is that drug information. Our second concept is our bowel nephrosis and also our GI adverse events. And then you can see we also have that line 14, that's a floating subheading. And so that is another search field that you may decide you want to search. Particularly important if you're searching surgery. Surgery floating subheading is really important. But you can see that the AE floating subheading is any adverse events. So for this question, very important for that to be included. So any adverse events related to this drug. Then we ORed all of our terms, and then we ended it with our original concept. And this result had 675 articles. I will say that is very low for a systematic review. I would say on average, mine range about 3 to 5,000. And now, I've had teams do 20,000 papers. I just don't really recommend it because it leads to burnout, and I would recommend narrowing your search before doing something so broad. But definitely all depends on the capacity of the research team and how many people you have as part of your group. And so then we translated that same search to Web of Science. So you can see our commands look a little different here. TS is our topic search. And so we're topic searching for the same concepts. And ending them together. And, there's a lot less results here, right? 162. So that's why I was saying I always start with Ovid Embase because it's the largest databases and I don't want surprises. We did talk about citation chasing, but there's a little more information on this slide, so I'm just going to highlight it really quick. Is that citation chasing can be a continuous process. So if you find 5 additional studies, you should probably run another citation chasing on those 5 studies. Again, deduplicating everything that you retrieved in the search and your citation chasing results from before, but those you should be also including because they may find relevant material, right? So if those were included and not described the same way as your included studies, then perhaps, there may be other studies out there that are similarly describing your paper and they're being cited by or are cited in your new citation chasing results. Oops, let me go back one more. So retracted articles, there's many different types of retracted articles. So you may want to think about what types you would continue to include. So if there was a data error in the manuscript and they fix it, is that unreliable? If there is a question about the scientific reliability or integrity of the work, are you still going to keep it in your study? How would you handle it? Are you going to just report the bias, do a sub-analysis without that paper and with it and see if it changes the results of your synthesis? There's many different options here. You just want to think about what's the best one for your study. And then the other really important question, right, is how to identify retracted articles. So if you do a search, you can do a hand search in any of the databases for your paper, and Depending on the database, it may have retracted as a tag, it may have retracted in the title. If you're using Ovid EndNote, you can do a find reference updates, and it will also tell you if that paper is retracted. It actually puts retracted papers now into separate like a group up at the top. So it highlights that it's been retracted and makes it easy for you to find. I think that is the fastest and quickest way, but is it the most reliable? You know, questionable, right? So just something to think about and just thinking about what works for your team. Okay, so we've gone through this very long lecture about evidence synthesis, and I hope this gave everybody a broad overview about, you know, establishing your research question, breaking it down into your framework that you're using, and then taking that information and developing your search and thinking about your search, how to preserve that search data. If you have any questions or you just want to talk about evidence synthesis methodology, please feel free to contact me, and my email is here, or to reach out to your research and education librarian. We love to talk about evidence synthesis, search techniques, or anything like that. So we would be happy to